Howdy, and welcome to Report Cards for Outlaws of Thunder Junction, Part 1. I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs. In this video series, I'll be reviewing every doggone rare from the Outlaws of Thunder Junction and giving them a letter grade based on how unique it is, the creative and deck building potential it encourages, and if it goes above and beyond being just a rare to truly feel mythic. Personally, I play Magic casually in the Commander format, so that's how I'll be evaluating these cards, and not really considering their impact on draft or limited environments, or constructed formats like Standard and Modern. Also, I want to say that I hold the designers at Wizards of the Coast in the highest regard, and I know all the requirements and deadlines they have to deal with when creating these cards are like herding cattle. I have the luxury of ignoring all that and simply building off of all of their hard work. With all of that said, I hope you'll find my ideas engaging, and I'll do my best to earn a like and subscribe from you by the end of the video. Without further ado, let's mosey on to the review. First up is Annie Flash, the Veteran. For 1 red, 1 green, 1 white, and 3 generic, you get a 4/5 legendary human rogue with Flash. When Annie Flash, the Veteran, enters the battlefield, if you cast it, return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Whenever Annie Flash becomes tapped, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. So first things first, this card is called Annie Flash, and it has Flash. So that's a good start. But after that, honestly, what the heck is this card? It resembles a Naya Sun Titan, but only when you cast it. And then it starts reckless impulsing whenever it becomes tapped. Naturally, this could occur when attacking, but this set includes mounts, which are creatures that have the saddle ability. So you can more or less crew that creature like you would a vehicle to receive some kind of bonus. In that context, the tap clause makes more sense, but even with that understanding, this card does not gel at all for me. I think the idea behind this card was printing a mythic rider that really incentivizes saddling up a creature. I like that her ability triggers off of attacking or crewing just as well, so it's flexible, but the bonus is just so generic and doesn't really make any thematic sense to me at all. In fact, nothing about this card feels right to me thematically. Annie's personal mount is Fortune Loyal Steed. She can recur Fortune when you cast her, but Fortune's ability doesn't actually combine with her in any meaningful way. And neither of these cards work with Annie Joins Up either, so we've got a flavor fail on multiple levels. Overall, this card is just a complete mess. It does a smattering of really tenuously related things, and feels totally generic at the same time. I understand there are probably some powerful combinations if you can find ways to tap and untap Annie repeatedly, but my grade isn't based solely on combos, and because of that and how incohesive this card is, I think the designers really missed the mark on this card. You can't spell Flash without F, and unfortunately, Annie fails. Next we have our first reprint of the set, Archangel of Tithes. For 3 white and 1 generic, you get a 3/5 angel creature with flying. As long as Archangel of Tithes is untapped, creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays 1 generic mana for each of those creatures. As long as Archangel of Tithes is attacking, creatures can't block unless their controller pays 1 generic for each of those creatures. This card originally debuted in Magic Origins back in 2015, and I think the power level shows to some extent. Not that I think this card is weak, but I think the mana value and the stat line would look very different if it were being designed today. As an example of white taxing effects, I think this card is spot on. The price your opponent has to pay isn't too steep, but it will add up, and it'll force them to make some difficult decisions with their mana budget, with possibly the greatest benefit being that your creatures will become unblockable if your opponent taps out. I love how it plays both sides of combat that way, and how giving the Angel Vigilance or finding a way to untap it lets you pressure your opponent's mana from all sides. Personally, I'm not a big fan of playing taxes in Magic, or in real life if I'm being honest. Happy April, all you working adults. And this design doesn't really move the needle as far as building around it is concerned. I'm not entirely sure it's significantly better than a rare card, so as to warrant mythic rarity status. But I do think this card is a poster example of how to do it, as both an angel and being quintessentially white. So for Archangel of Tithes 1040 form, I'm going to give it a B. We have our third white-based mythic in a row, Assimilation Aegis. For 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 generic, you get an artifact equipment that says, when Assimilation Aegis enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target creature until Assimilation Aegis leaves the battlefield. Whenever Assimilation Aegis becomes attached to a creature, for as long as Assimilation Aegis remains attached to it, that creature becomes a copy of a creature card exiled with Assimilation Aegis. You can equip for 2 generic mana. White and blue removal have the caveat of leaving something behind for your opponent, Sometimes it's a creature token, and other times it's an enchantment that they can interact with. And if they do so, they get their permanent back. That latter category is the type I try to avoid, because it's going to feel real bad when the card you thought you'd taken care of suddenly returns to play, gets another enter the battlefield trigger, and eats your attacker in the process. They've tried a few variations of this at Mythic Rare in the past, and while I appreciate the designs and exploring that space, they largely just boil down to hitting more targets and eventually becoming a bigger blowout if your opponent ever does get to remove it. Assimilation Aegis does tread new ground in that it's an equipment and not an enchantment, and it can turn your weakest creature into your opponent's strongest creature. That is a potentially very powerful effect and could cause a major swing in board presence. There also is some utility in the option to exile one of your own creatures, but unless you have some purposeful interactions in mind, I don't see that as a real selling point on this card. I do like this design overall, though I really have no intention of ever using it myself. Again, I applaud exploring this design space, but I think this card doesn't do enough to rate as a mythic. Is it dramatically more powerful than any of these effects that are printed at Rare? That certainly doesn't seem to be the case to me. I'm open to the possibility that this card plays far better than I realize, but I think it could really stand to use some significant tweaking. All said, I think Assimilation Aegis is a D. Moving on, we have Bristly Bill, Spine Sower. For 1 green and 1 generic, you get a 2/2 legendary plant druid. Bristly Bill has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Then, for 2 green and 3 generic, you can double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Let me start by saying that I like this card. I think it's very powerful, I want to use it. But I have to tell you, I'm repelled by almost all of the creative elements on it. I don't like that it's a legend. Not that I don't think it could be, but it just seems like every mythic creature they print is a legend by default anymore. Also, I do not like the name Bristly Bill. I mean, I like the name, but I think it belongs in an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. I'm Dirty Dad! I'm Dirty Dad! And while I think the concept and the art are largely very cool, am I the only one who looked at this card first and didn't see that it had a face? It's got some kind of weird like fin thing on the side of its head here, and when I first saw the card, I thought that was Bristly Bill's nose. Upon closer inspection, I do see there is a face with these tiny little beady eyes, but that first impression will never go away for me. So it looked like he had no face and just a big dumb cactus nose. I don't know, it just looked totally derpy to me. And like, who speaks of this legendary creature in hushed tones? His name is goofy, his face is goofy. Why isn't the art depicting him growing these massive thorns on the things around him? I really want to be shown why this guy is a powerful legend who does things no other creature can do. As for the abilities, the first one is fine. It's appeared on multiple cards throughout the years and at much lower rarities than Mythic, so it doesn't really make a splash in that sense. But let's be honest, it's Billy's activated ability that we're all really here for. It's got incredibly explosive potential. We have seen it in some form before, but having it readily available on an activated ability makes it that much more abusable. If you have 7 mana, that means you can cast Bristly Bill and activate his ability at the same turn. And quite frankly, the option to activate the ability multiple times in a single turn is pretty degenerate. So this card is a mixed bag for me. Half of its text is pretty run-of-the-mill, and the other half I think is fairly mythic worthy. In my opinion, it's packaged onto a bit of a goofball of a character, but maybe that aspect will appeal to a lot of people. My personal opinion on the overall design of this card though, Bristly Bill bags a B. The alliteration continues with Double Down, a blue enchantment for 1 blue and 3 generic. Double Down says, whenever you cast an outlaw spell, copy that spell. Assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, and warlocks are all outlaws. If you want to encourage players to use a certain archetype, things like doubling and copying are a great incentive. And Double Down does exactly what it says, doubling all of your outlaw spells. This is a great effect, but I think it's a little too on the nose for my liking. It's essentially just a copy and paste of Necro Duality, though I appreciate that it's more open-ended in the number of creature types that it supports. Pirates are certainly experiencing a big push these days, but I'm curious to see what the Warlock type has to offer. I do really like when a card inspires me to look back into Magic's catalog, revisit some forgotten sets, and see old cards in a brand new light. Double Down certainly encourages that, and I'm excited to see what other combinations players will come up with. Still, this design is pretty much a reskin, so I don't think I can rate it higher than a B. Though I was tempted to say Double Down deserves a D. We're halfway through this hoedown. If you take a moment just to like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. It's the final showdown. For 1 white, you get an instant with Spree, which means you choose 1 or more additional costs as you cast this spell. The first option for 1 generic is all creatures lose all abilities until end of turn. A second option for 1 generic is choose a creature you control. It gains indestructible until end of turn. And the final option is 2 white and 3 generic, destroy all creatures. Let me start off by saying that Spree is a very cool new mechanic. And by new, I mean a version of Kicker that's fresh and exciting. Essentially, it lets you build your own spell. And while it's similar to mechanics like Escalation, there are some important differences. Typically, with modal spells, I feel like you pay a little more than a given effect would normally cost. But aside from the second mode on this card, I think you're paying essentially retail price for these effects. The first mode is comparable to Dress Down, though not drawing a card is a substantial downgrade. There's a lot of utility with it though, as it can be used to knock flyers out of the air so you can block them, tramplers and death touch creatures lose their advantage in combat, and hexproof, ward, and indestructible shields can be lowered. There are loads of other possible interactions. Just be careful you don't overlook how this will affect your own creatures. Mode number 2 is akin to any number of protection spells we've seen recently, though for this price you would expect some additional upside. An important note is, one advantage of the wording to this mode is that you're choosing the creature. That means your opponent won't know what creature you've chosen until the spell resolves. So they can't respond by killing the creature you would choose, unless they guess correctly or you happen to only have 1 creature available. The third mode looks like a pretty standard wrath effect, but it's discounted compared to traditional instant speed wraths that we've seen in the past. Speaking of which, check out my Recycled Ideas video, where I critique and then redesign Fated Retribution and the rest of the cards in the Fated cycle. So ultimately, you aren't getting full value out of each mode, but you aren't really paying that much above market price either, especially considering the excellent utility being offered here. So I feel like this is a terrific design that gives you powerful options at reasonable costs and uses a new mechanic to showcase it. That's a fantastic package and one that I have to give an A. Next up is Geralf the Fleshwright. I don't actually know how you pronounce this card. It looks like Gerald to me, but just with an F, so I'm going with Geralf. Sorry. For 1 blue and 2 generic, you get a 2/3 legendary human warlock. Whenever you cast a spell during your turn, other than the first spell that turn, create a 2/2 blue and black zombie rogue creature token. Whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other zombie that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. One of the great joys of Magic is casting spells. This set encourages you to do that in bunches, and Geralf is a prime example of that. The first spell you cast on your turn doesn't get you anything, but your second spell will generate a 2/2 zombie rogue creature. Your third spell on your turn will give you another zombie rogue, but with a +1/+1 counter. Essentially, every spell beyond the first will create a token with that much power and toughness. So theoretically, if you can chain 5 spells together, you'll have a 2/2, 3/3, 4/4, and a 5/5. Granted, if you're going to be able to reliably cast 5 spells in a single turn, then maybe you could just build a storm deck. But I think that strategy prefers to focus on instants and sorceries, so Geralf doesn't exactly fit that mold because he requires the spells to be cast on your turn only. And since his second ability cares so much about zombies, he would naturally fit into a zombie-centric deck. I like that the +1/+1 counter trigger only cares about zombies entering the battlefield. That means any non-creature spells you cast that generate zombie tokens can also take advantage of this effect. For example, if you cast Army of the Damned, you'll wind up with 13 zombie tokens that all have 12 +1/+1 counters on them. There's plenty of power in this card, and just enough versatility that he can be employed in very differently designed decks. To me, that's an excellent combination for a mythic, and I give Geralf an A. Next is our second Naya mythic, Ghired, Mirror of the Wilds. For 1 red, 1 green, and 1 white, you get a 3/3 legendary human shaman with haste. Non-token creatures you control have tap, create a token that's a copy of target token you control that entered the battlefield this turn. I adore mythics like this. There isn't a ton of text on this card, but what it asks of you is complex. You want to design your deck with token generators, so that way you can copy the tokens with Ghired. But you can get multiples of your tokens the more non-token creatures you have. So you want to fit as many non-token creatures into your deck as you can as well. Not only will that be a fun balance to strike, but you also have to look and see what tokens you want to create in the first place. Certainly creature tokens are a fine place to start, and to me, the most attractive candidates are non-token creatures that create them. Of course, there are plenty of non-creature tokens to generate as well, like food, clues, and treasure. But what I want to accomplish is on another level entirely. These cards let you make token copies of artifacts and enchantments. So for example, since every token-based deck is going to include Anointed Procession, why not use Yenna to make a copy of that? and that will enable Ghired and every other non-token creature you control to make a copy of the Anointed Procession token. That's just one example, and I think there are loads more wild and degenerate combinations you can accomplish with Ghired. The individualization you can put into him is fabulous, and I'm excited to see what other players come up with. And all that for only 3 mana and just a few lines of text. So next time you hear me criticize the Elder Gargoths of the world with their endless lines of text and completely disjointed abilities, this is why. Ghired Mirror of the Wilds is simply top-notch design, and that's why I have to create a whole new grade and slot it into the S tier. Now comes our first mythic rare featuring Gisa, the Hellraiser. Again, when you say these names out loud, I'm not certain how to pronounce them, but I always read this as like Gisa except I'm not sure, so Gisa makes sense. For 2 black and 3 generic, you get a 4/4 legendary human warlock with ward, 2 generic, and pay 2 life. Gisa also says, skeletons and zombies you control get +1/+1 and have menace. Finally, whenever you commit a crime, create 2 tapped 2/2 blue and black zombie rogue creature tokens. This ability triggers only once each turn. Committing a crime means targeting your opponents, anything they control, and or cards in their graveyard. So I find everything about this card completely agreeable. The cost is reasonable, the stat line is not bad, the word cost is prickly, the number of tokens you make is above average, and the Anthem effect bestows a strong keyword to boot. Now if you've watched any of my other videos, and based on what I was just talking about with Elder Gargoth, you know I look down on cards that are just overloaded with text. So the hypocrisy is not lost on me, because when I saw this card I thought, I wish this card did just a little bit more. To be honest, this card is setting you up very nicely. Gisa is only asking you to find some creative ways to commit crimes. And if you do, the tokens will start flooding the board. She has the potential to make 8 of them per turn cycle after all. So if you told me I was asking for too much, I'd certainly agree with you. I think I would gladly trade the ward ability, and I could part with one or even both halves of the Anthem effect too. In exchange, I strongly feel like this card should provide you with the ability to commit 1 crime per turn cycle. I think part of my disappointment stems from Gisa being depicted as incessantly meddling with graves and buried bodies wherever she goes in the story. And while both Geralf and her make zombies, which is in line with their characters, neither one of them actually manipulates the graveyard. So I think this is a very good card, and the design gives you plenty. It just doesn't land for me, somewhat mechanically and somewhat flavorfully. So with that in mind, I can only elevate this Hellraiser to a B. And our final card for today's review is Goldvein Hydra. For 1 green and X generic mana, you get a 0/0 Hydra with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. Goldvein Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. When Goldvein Hydra dies, create a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to its power. This card certainly strikes it rich when it comes to being powerful, exciting, and unique. But I really think it's pushed just a bit too far, and I wish the designers went with a less is more approach. As far as the stats and mana cost go, this is a pretty bog standard Hydra card. The appeal is absolutely in the fact that instead of spawning new heads, this Hydra generates treasure. The scalability is simply huge. Is that a pun? Hydras have scales, right? And you don't even have to cast this spell for an exorbitant amount. Pump spells, +1/+1 counters, and anthems will all increase Goldvein's value. So this creature can be a significant threat to your opponent, and at the same time, it also might be worth more to you dead than alive. When either of those outcomes is beneficial to you, that's a great place to be. Where I have an issue with this card is the keywords. Did it really need to have all of them? Trample is perfectly acceptable to me, and I think exactly the kind of ability you want on a creature that can scale in power. But does it really need to be vigilant? Certainly that creates more incentive for your opponent to kill it, because it will be protecting your life total while pressuring theirs. But then why does it have to have haste? Does it really need to be able to get onto the board and start causing a ruckus right away? Maybe these are considerations for competitive formats, but I would rather see this card toned down to just having trample. That would keep the focus and appeal of this card on the fact that it's a treasure piñata. So while this card certainly has a head for being unique and powerful, it strikes me as being a little too close to the generic green mythic creature with a whole bunch of text design. And for those reasons, I'm going to give Goldvein Hydra a B. And that's where we'll holster this review for today. Let me know what grades you think I hit the bull on, and which ones you reckon I missed the mark. I hope you found my thoughts to be engaging, and maybe you found some nuances in these designs to appreciate that you didn't think about before. If so, I'd be much obliged if you'd like, subscribe, and share this video. You can follow me on X at UnsolicitedMTG for more channel updates and nonsense like this, my fabulous rendition of Oko's 11. Be sure to saddle up next week where I'll round up the remaining mythics in part 2. Thanks for watching, partner. I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs, and who asked me anyway?